What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Utah Airguns channel. Today we are talking about just kidding, we're talking about scopes, obviously. Today we're going to go over basically what you should think about and some things you should consider when buying a rifle scope. And obviously we have the full spectrum of optics with different features, different magnifications, different price ranges, stuff like that. So I'm just going to go over some of the things that I take into consideration when I am buying a rifle scope, whether it's for an air rifle or a centerfire or a rimfire. So I'll start by kind of explaining some of the features of the scopes and different optics terms that you should know when you're looking at buying a new scope, basically anywhere on the spectrum of price range. So I'll start on a very low tier scope and go over just some of the features that you're going to find on this. So a few things that come into play when you're buying a scope that affect its optical performance are, one, the objective size. This is probably a 50mm objective. Oh, yep, it's a 4 to 12 by 50. Your tube size, this is a 1-inch tube, and your magnification. So basically what's happening with a scope is you are trying to gather as much light as possible through the objective lens and basically project it onto your optical nerve. And big objective lens obviously gather a lot of light, but that light can be kind of fuzzied and faded through your tube. And that is why there is a big variance in some scopes when it comes to tube size. Obviously, the bigger the tube, the more light transmission and the easier the light is going to travel through a larger tube. So this is just a Hawk Air Max. It is a 1-inch tube. These are probably around 100, 150 bucks for this scope. Obviously the optical performance isn't going to be amazing, but it's a great beginner scope, especially on basically any air rifle. It's going to still look great out to 100, 200 yards. And some other things that aren't as optimal on the lower end scopes are when you have a higher magnification scope, kind of like this one, you have parallax. And what is that? What most people think parallax is just the focus, but what parallax actually is, if you look up the definition of parallax, it is the visual relation of two objects at a distance. So like if you put two fingers up like this and you move your head, this one seems to be moving more than the far one. And basically what parallax is doing, yes, you are focusing your image, but you're focusing your reticle to that image. So you're basically superimposing your reticle onto that image. So when your parallax is out of focus, it looks like when you move your head on your scope, that crosshair will look like it's moving around your target. So when you focus your parallax, you get that reticle focused to your target. When you move your head, it kind of locks your reticle onto your target. And that's why some people will have issues with switching guns. Like if your buddy shoots your gun and you haven't kind of focused it to your eye, it might be like his zero is off. And also if your cheek isn't in the exact same spot, every time when your parallax is off, it'll look like your zero has shifted. So on these lower end scopes, after I went on that tangent of what parallax is, anyway, on lower end scopes that have the higher magnification, some of the lower end ones will have the parallax up on the objective lens, and it's still very usable. It's still good that it has a parallax adjustment, but it's not ideal being up on the objective lens. It's just harder to reach up and kind of break position rather than having it back on near your turrets. Another feature on lower end scopes will be your focal plane, and focal plane isn't necessarily exclusive to lower end scopes, but most lower end scopes are second focal plane. So what second focal plane is when you have a reticle that has any kind of mil or MOA subtensions in it that are used for making correct holds and measurements, is with a second focal plane scope that has subtensions in it that are calibrated to either mils or MOA, you will have to be on a certain magnification for those measurements to be accurate. And when you zoom in and out, the reticle will essentially stay the same size throughout the whole magnification range, whereas with first focal plane, when you zoom in or out, it looks like you are zooming into your reticle. Your reticle will get bigger, and those subtensions, those measurements are calibrated throughout the entire magnification range of that scope. And generally, first focal plane scopes cost more. So that's kind of a higher end feature, but there are a lot of mid-tier and even lower tier, more affordable scopes that are first focal plane, which is cool. Wow, that was a long breath. When I talk about, I love scopes. I'm a huge optics nerd, so I just info dump. So I'll jump up to the higher end, and basically all these scopes are anywhere from $2,800 to $4,000 scopes. So they're extremely good glass, very high end. And I'll show you the features that come on those scopes that are also similar to the low end scopes. So this is a Zeiss S5, a 5 to 25. This scope has extremely good glass. It's first focal plane. The S5s are known for having a lot of elevation in their turrets. So what you're doing is when you dial your turret, when you dial it up, you're essentially moving your crosshairs, your point of zero, your point of aim, lower to compensate for the bullet drop or pellet drop or whatever gun it's on. And one of the benefits to the higher end scopes is obviously there's going to be more precision. So on these lower end scopes, you have what's called tracking, and that's how accurate, how precise each one of these clicks are in your scope compared to a lower end scope. So with a scope like this or any of these higher end scopes, I can go from my zero, either 35 yards or 100 yards on a center fire, and say I'm going to make a 1,000-yard shot on my center fire. I can dial that all the way up to whatever my hold is going to be, make that shot, and then say, okay, I want to come back to 100 yards. I can come back to my zero, and I will still be perfectly zeroed. That scope will have tracked up and back down to the exact same spot where you have your zero stop set. Whereas lower end scopes, it'll come back down, and some of them are very reliable, but some may have tracking issues, and over time tracking issues may arise. So that's one of the benefits to kind of the buy once, cry once philosophy, which I'm a huge advocate of, having broken a lot of scopes, a lot of low-end scopes, and now the owner of a few really high-end scopes. That is a huge benefit, is the tracking. Moving along to showing the features that the low-end scopes have that also the higher-end scopes have. Like I said, the parallax was up here on the cheaper Hawk optic. The parallax is on the left side here, and is just a little bit more convenient, a little bit easier to access, and a little bit smoother and precise. It still is effectively the exact same function, it's doing the exact same thing, it's focusing your reticle and your image to your target, but just in a little bit more convenient and precise spot. In this Hawk scope, when you move the parallax, you can actually see your objective lens move in and out, and that could be a failure point. Dust can get in that spot because it's exposing part of the internals of the scope when it's moving that lens in and out. But on these higher end scopes, it's not moving anything externally, and it's not going to let any debris or dust inside. So moving on to the reticle. There are basically a million different kinds of reticles, styles. Each brand kind of has their own take on a dirty reticle and a clean reticle. So basically what I consider a dirty reticle or a Christmas tree reticle is, we'll put some images up here to give you a better idea. But a dirty reticle will have your normal regular crosshairs, center aiming point, but it will have a grid that kind of goes out like a Christmas tree. And it will have different aiming points. It can have dots, or it can have different subtension lines. And basically that's doing for you is giving you another option to compensate for drop and for wind. So basically those numbers and those lines in that scope are directly correlate with the numbers on your turrets. So instead of dialing up 5.5 mils, I can just hold 5.5 mils in my scope and leave my scope at 0. If I don't want to keep track of where my turret is at, I can just do holds, and then that Christmas tree will also follow your lateral subtension lines to also give you wind holds when you are holding. Say I hold 5.5 and 1.2 for wind, I have possibly a grid dot exactly where that hold is going to be, so that I have a much more precise aiming point, rather than on a clean reticle where it could just be straight crosshairs, no subtensions, no measurements, or it just has those subtensions on your X and Y axis, but no Christmas tree that comes out. So I kind of have to hold out in space, guessing where that wind hold is going to be rather than holding like dead center line. So that's kind of the main difference between like a clean reticle and a dirty reticle. And I much prefer a dirty reticle or a Christmas tree. I like having the options for holds, and I also like having the options to give other people corrections. So what I mean by that is if I'm spotting for someone, whether through a scope or a spotting scope that also has a reticle, I can put my crosshair where they're aiming and say they miss. I can give them an exact correction based on where that round landed in relation to the target. I can say, oh, you were 2.2 left and probably 0.5 low. And I can give that measurement to them, and if they have a mil reticle in their scope, they can make that correction either in the reticle or they can make that adjustment on their scope. And if my correction was good and if their shooting was good, that should put them back like center of target if the shooting conditions haven't changed. So that's one of the big benefits of running a dirty reticle or a Christmas tree reticle or whatever you want to call it. So now that I've gone over kind of the basics of scopes like reticle, tube size, optical clarity and stuff like that. One of the things I like to consider first when I'm buying a scope is obviously budget. So if you're just going to be kind of a weekend warrior and you're not going to be using your scope often or shooting very often, then a lower end scope is going to do you just fine. You're not going to put a lot of wear on it. It's not going to break down over time if it's sitting most of the week or most of the month. But if you're going to be a lot more serious, if you're competing, if you're an avid hunter that actually relies on the animal that you kill to feed your family, or if you're in law enforcement or military, you obviously are going to be depending on your optic and you want to get the better stuff. It's obviously more expensive, but that means you're going to get a lot more reliability out of that optic. So I just like to sit down and be like, all right, here's my budget. Here's what I'm allocating for my rifle, and here's what I'm allocating for my optic. And we've kind of lined them up from obviously cheapest $100 to $200 all the way up to $3,000 to $4,000. So as you kind of go up the price range, obviously you're going to start getting more features. Your reliability is going to go up. But there are some really, really nice scopes starting in like the $300 to $600 range that you're going to get a lot of features. You're going to have locking turrets. You're going to have first focal plane. You're going to have a zero stop, stuff like that you're getting. Normally back in the day, you would have to spend a lot more, but technology has come to a point where we're able to produce some really nice scopes at a very affordable point. So like this Athlon, this is a first focal plane scope. It's got exposed turrets. Most of the time your lower end scopes aren't going to have exposed turrets. They'll just have capped, and some of them won't even have like numbers on your turret. It'll just say 1 click equals a quarter minute at 100 yards, and it'll just have lines. And another thing that obviously as you move up the higher end scopes is the clicks will be a lot more tactile and substantial. I like to call them crispy clicks. Like this, it doesn't feel like there's clicks at all. It just has a sound. And a lot of people say clicks don't matter in a scope. Sorry, I'm going off on a tangent, but I think this is a valuable point. But those clicks are there for a reason. So like on this scope, each click is a 1/10 of a mil at 100 yards. And what those clicks are is rotating the mechanism that is raising or lowering your optic, but that is raising it the 1/10. And if you have a more hard, substantial click, that means that movement is like moving up and locking. When you have a very squishy turret where you can kind of even set the turret in between a click like this one, this is actually a pretty good turret, that means that you're only moving it like 7/10 or like half of that 1/10 mil. And so as you track farther up in the range of elevation, that means your elevation is going to be off in regards to the measurement that you think you're putting into the scope. So substantial, hard, tactile clicks are very important, especially in long range shooting, because you want when you're dialing 13 mils for a very long shot, you want to know that you've dialed exactly 13 mils and not 12.8, because over the range of that elevation, you've kind of come out of tolerance because you've had the clicks are not as substantial as they should be. But anyway, back to getting cool features on lower end scopes. This one, you'll have the parallax down by your turrets. You'll have an illuminated reticle first focal plane, obviously, with a nice Christmas tree reticle, and this scope is only about $320. Obviously, your optical performance isn't going to be to the level of the high-end stuff, but this would be a fantastic rimfire or air rifle scope for your kids, or even you if you just want to shoot on the weekends. So then, as we start moving up into the $500 range, we're still getting those same features, but we're getting just better optical performance. We have this one still first focal plane. You have good turrets. One of the cool features on these element scopes is what's called a zero stop. So once you've gone through and zeroed your scopes, it's obviously when you put your scope on, it's not going to be on. You have to zero your scope. Your turret will be off of zero. And one thing that's cool on these element scopes is the toolless zero set and zero stop. So all you have to do is take this cap off, pull your turret off, put it back to zero, and put that back on, and you're set. Now, a zero stop isn't essential, but it's very nice, because obviously when you make a long distance shot, or when you're compensating for that bullet drop, if you move your turret, say you dial 5 mils for however far you're going to shoot, make that shot, and then you come back to zero, you want to bring that back, and you don't need a zero stop. That's why I said it's not essential. You just have to pay attention that you bring that turret back to your 0 point, or the measurement that's marked 0 on your turret. What a zero stop is a system in the turret that stops your turret. On these element scopes, it's 0.5 past your 0. So you can be like, if it's dark, or if you just want to check, say you're kind of second guessing yourself on a shot on an animal and it's low light and you don't want to take your eyes off the animal, you can take your turret, move it to 0, and on these element scopes, it's 0.5 past your 0. So then you can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you're back on 0. So then you know your gun is zeroed at its 0 point, and you don't have to worry about it. And other scopes will have that 0. You can set the zero stop to exactly your 0. It's not going to go any past. But with these element scopes, you don't have to mess with the zero stop. The zero stop is always set. So that's one super nice thing. And that's something that you start to get in the much higher end scopes. They're like, these helixes also have a zero stop, but you have to set the zero stop after you've zeroed it. It's a pretty simple process. It's on their YouTube channel, but the lower end scopes will also have that same system, that same zero stop. This one's obviously been zipped out, but it'll have that hard zero stop that you have to set once you've zeroed your gun. And it's very nice, because then you're confident, you know that you've come down that full revolution if you've gone up higher. And speaking of revolutions, that takes me to another really cool feature of the higher end scopes, and that is a revolution counter, or rev indicator. So if you've taken a really long shot, you've gone a full revolution in your turret, you'll see that little mechanism move over and say 2. So that means you're on your second revolution, because you could be at 0 and think you're at your 0 point, but when you go to take your shot, you're going to yard sail that shot 10 mils over your target. So that is just an indicator that you need to bring that down a full revolution, and you'll go back down and hit your zero stop, and you're good. And most of the higher end scopes will have some kind of rev indicator. Some don't, but the ones that do, it's very nice to have, because I've shot over prairie dogs, I've shot over the berm because I wasn't paying attention, and I just bombed a shot way over because I wasn't paying attention to where my turret was at. So that is a very nice feature to have, and it usually is available on the much higher end scopes. One of the things that is starting to come on the more affordable scopes, like I said earlier, is illumination. And what that is doing is exactly what you think it is. It's lighting up your reticle for the lower light shots. And personally, most of my scopes have illumination, and I almost never use it, because I don't really shoot that much in low light or in darkness. If I do, I'm using some kind of clip-on thermal or night vision. And because I have the contrast of the lighted image being projected into the scope, it's just like shooting at the daytime, and I don't feel the need to illuminate my reticle. But most of these higher end scopes have some kind of illumination, either a button or a whole other dial that you can dial up or down your illumination based on how much light you need to be projected into your reticle. But illumination isn't a deal breaker for me, but when you go non-illuminated, it can save you like $400 or $500 depending on the scope, from what I've seen in different scope models. As you move into the higher end scopes, I've had a lot of people say, why does a scope cost $3,000 to even $5,000 when you get into the really high-end scopes. And that is because of, there's multiple things, but really what it boils down to is glass quality and just the precision of the turret system, because there's a lot of machining and very fine, almost watch-like mechanisms that need to be durable that's in a turret. And that is what translates to repeatability and durability in the field. The more precise and durable the mechanism is in the turret, the better results you're going to have in the field, the more accurate your shots are going to be, and the longer that scope is going to last and more durable it's going to be if you're beating it up, if it's bouncing around in your truck, which obviously you should take care of your glass, even though the higher end stuff can take it. But you should always be wary of how you're treating your glass, because they can break, and I have broken scopes before. The other thing that makes scopes so expensive is obviously the glass that goes into them. And it is quite the process to make very clear and high optically performing glass that's not going to kind of limit and slow down and mess up the light that you're trying to see. And I mean, there's tons of other videos that show you how high-end glass is made. But once you look through really high-end scopes, you know, like Night Force, like Schmidt and Bender, like Zeiss, Tangent Theta, Collis, once you look through those scopes and then compare it directly to a mid-tier to a cheap scope, you kind of start to understand. And once you get into this higher range of scope, like once you basically like hit $2,500 and up, there is quite a bit of difference when you get to like, you know, $3,500 and $5,000. There's you start to see the real edge when you start to look in more challenging situations. But you start to understand like the clarity. Like one good test for scopes is obviously low light performance. Go out in the morning or at sunset and look at stuff, because it's gathering in a lot more light, and because they're all receiving the same amount of light in the objective lens, but it's how they are kind of translating that light to your eye is what's going to kind of separate the high end from the low end. But one of the tests I like to do is I'll take a scope, and if it's during the day, I like to try and find shade and shadows at distance and look into those shadows and see if I can distinguish anything, like if I can find any distinguishing features on the tree trunk, if there's animals, if there's anything sitting under there that I can pick out and distinguish with detail. And that is where you'll start to see the big separation between the high and the low end on optics. Is the high end is letting you see that limited amount of light that's being kind of hidden by the shade, and pick out those details, like if there's an elk or a deer bedded down. The high-end scopes are going to be able to pick that up. They're going to give you as much of a chance to see that little bit of light that could be their antlers or their face or their fur, whereas these lower-end scopes will definitely struggle with that because they're not processing that light well enough to let your naked eye see it. Another thing that goes into the higher-end scopes, and all scopes have a coating, but the higher end scopes will have very specific kinds of coatings that will help it perform in more adverse conditions, and will help that color to be more true to your eye as well, because that's obviously going to help you distinguish targets and animals as well. But certain coatings will help it to shed water and fog. It'll prevent them from fogging up. But mostly what those coatings are doing is making the color more true. So what's happening when light is going through your scope, that full color spectrum can be kind of filtered out and degraded through the glass, but those coatings can help kind of richen the color and make it more true to your eye, so that when you look at your scope, everything's not duller or different colored. That's why certain scopes and certain like binoculars, when you look through them, you're like, oh, this kind of looks green or this kind of looks blue. That's the coating that they're using to richen and deepen the color. Or on some binoculars that have a HUD or a different kind of reticle in them that's projected, they need a coating in there so that that projection is reflected back to your eye rather than just kind of going out the front of the scope. And you'll notice that on laser range finding binoculars and other things that have a HUD inside of them. But for the most part, scopes don't have HUDs in them, so they don't need that kind of coating. Now that I've kind of broken down the high end from the low end, the features, things you want to look for, now we can kind of start to pick apart what features and what type of scope we want on what type of gun. For the most part, all these scopes will be very effective for long range, minus these ones. down here at the end, the ones that have cap turrets and just normal reticles in them. And you don't necessarily have to use these scopes for long range, but these features were kind of intended for long range. That exposed turret that you can move, the hard clicks, the nice crispy turrets, the reticle, the Christmas tree reticle, so that you can hold instead of dial on your turret, the high magnification. So after you've kind of defined your budget, how much you want to spend on a scope, you need to decide what it's going on and what you want to do. So I like to kind of, when people ask me what kind of scope they want to get, I say, how far are you shooting? After I say, what gun is it going on? They're like, oh, I only need to reach 200 yards. Okay, then we can, unless you're just a baller and just want to have an ultra high-end scope, then we can just kind of not even worry about these crazy high-end, high magnification scopes. We can stay with the lower budget, lower magnification scopes because they're going to be plenty for what you're doing inside of 200 yards. So you can get a little 4 to 14 Athlon, so that's plenty of magnification to see lots of detail at 200 yards. You'll have the exposed turrets, so you can kind of get into the long range stuff. You can dial for targets inside of 200 yards, especially if you're using like an air rifle or rimfire. 200 yards is a pretty good poke. So that at 200 yards, you're probably going to be holding 7 or 8 mils, and you can learn like holds in your reticle and dialing your turret to make those shots. But if you want to shoot farther and put it on a bigger gun, you're going to need a little bit more durability, and you're also going to need that optical performance of these higher end scopes. And once you get into these kind of mid-tier scopes, they're around $500 to $1,000. You're getting that better optical performance. You're getting better tracking turrets. You're getting a little bit more intuitive reticles, but you're paying for it. But you will start to notice that over these lower end scopes. Once you start to use them and look through them, you'll be able to pick things up better. But if you really want to invest in a scope, if you're relying on it for hunting or livelihood, if you're a competitive shooter that needs to win some checks and take stuff off the prize table, or if you're LEO or law enforcement, you definitely need that optical performance and durability because you're potentially making life-changing shots. You need that optical performance. You're going to pay for it, but like I said earlier, you are going to see the difference when you look into the more challenging situations, low light, looking into shadows, stuff like that. You're getting that ultra precise tracking in the turrets. You're getting much more intuitive reticles. You're getting really good magnification, and the list goes on and on. When you get into the really high-end scopes, you can definitely depend on them more. They're much more durable, much more reliable. So guys, if I missed anything, obviously drop it in the comments. But to summarize, just kind of wrap it up, just start with your budget. That narrows it down quite a bit. But luckily nowadays, there's a lot of feature-packed scopes for very affordable prices. I'm a big advocate of buy once, cry once. Save the money, get the higher end scope. I've never had anyone come back and complain like, why'd you tell me to spend $3,000 on a scope? They almost always come back like, dude, the glass is insane. And good glass makes everything better, but that's not to discredit the cheaper scopes. Every day they're getting optically better. So yeah, start with a budget, pick the features that you want, and that really starts to narrow down in your price range and also in what is available. If you want exposed turrets, if you want first or second focal plane, illuminated reticle, stuff like that, what magnification, and eventually you'll land on a pretty good scope. Most scope makers have a full line from like low budget to ultra high end. Usually the ultra high end scopes don't do much in the budget range, but some do. So you can still get a nice Night Force like these SHVs. They're great. Not as many features, but good glass and a great price. Same with Element. Element is a pretty heavy hitter when it comes to really good budget scopes that are very feature packed. I think the Nexus Gen 2 is one of the best scopes you can buy right now. For $2,000, you get all the features, great high-end glass, great reticle, very cool toolless turrets with a nice zero stop, and for $2,000 you can put this on pretty much any gun and you'll be very happy with it. I'm also a big Night Force guy. I also have a Zeiss, I also have Kales. I love scopes, and I have a wide array of them, and once you get into the higher end range, you're probably not going to be unhappy with any of them. But yeah, start with a budget, pick your features. If you have more questions, we're always happy to answer any of those questions, either on the phone, on our socials, or in the comments of this video. Drop any questions that you have. Our sales guys are happy to answer anything. If you're local, come and look. We have a very wide selection of scopes. Like, this is not even a fraction of what we offer right now. So we definitely have something for you, whether it's air rifle or centerfire. Again, drop your questions in the comment section if I missed anything, or if you have any more questions on what scope you should buy. But don't forget to like the video, share it, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.